What does it take to make a horror film so violent that the British Censorship Board needed an entirely new framework to address it? 8 films from the 1970s, all blood, no apology, and a body count that the era's regulatory system was not prepared to certify. The last one on tonight's list got a director sued by his own church. If you have been collecting these forgotten titles with us, you know exactly what is coming. Subscribe now if this is your first time here. There are over 60 videos in this archive, and every one of them is built exactly like this. Like this video the moment you recognize a title. And leave the goriest scene you remember from any film on tonight's list in the comments, because I want to know if you flinched the same way the 1970s censors did.
Did we vote to women?
But they weren't human, sir. They were...
Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. Directed by Piers Haggard. A farmer plowing his field unearths something resembling a skull, with one remaining eye, and the discovery sets off a wave of demonic possession among the children of a remote English village that spreads with the specific patience of a contagion, rather than the urgency of a conventional horror threat, building toward a finale that the British folk horror tradition has never matched for sheer accumulated dread. Tygon British Film Productions released Blood on Satan's Claw as part of the same loose folk horror cycle that Witchfinder General had established 3 years earlier. A tradition built on the specific terror of rural English isolation, where institutional authority is distant, and the landscape itself seems complicit in whatever is rising from it. Piers Haggard directed with a formal patience that the genre's commercial expectations did not require, allowing the village's social fabric to disintegrate gradually rather than through a single triggering event, which gives the film's violence a cumulative weight that more conventional horror structures could not produce. Linda Hayden plays Angel Blake, the possessed teenage ringleader, with a performance whose specific blend of innocence and predatory menace the British Censorship Board found difficult to certify without cuts. Not because any single scene crossed an explicit line, but because the film's accumulated tone communicated something the regulatory framework had no clean instrument for measuring. Patrick Wymark plays the local judge, whose rationalist framework proves catastrophically insufficient against what the village is actually facing. A performance that anchors the film's procedural horror in genuine institutional failure rather than supernatural spectacle alone. The barn sequence, in which the possessed children corner an isolated victim with a coordinated, almost ritualistic violence that the practical effects team staged with deliberate restraint, was the content the British Board of Film Censors required cuts to before certification. Not for graphic excess, but for the specific psychological dread the staging produced. A sequence that remains the most cited image among the folk horror cycle's devoted following. Blood on Satan's Claw has been released through Anchor Bay and subsequently Severin Films in restored editions. Piers Haggard worked primarily in British television afterward. Linda Hayden continued working in British exploitation cinema through the decade. The English village locations remain identifiable and largely unchanged. Blood on Satan's Claw built its horror from rural isolation and a contagion of possession. The Flesh and Blood show built its horror from something considerably more theatrical. An actual abandoned seaside theater, a troupe of actors rehearsing inside it, and a killer whose connection to the building's specific history Pete Walker withheld with the patience of a director, who understood that English seaside decay was its own form of dread. The Flesh and Blood show, 1972, directed by Pete Walker. A theater company rehearses a play in an abandoned seaside pavilion theater, unaware that someone with a specific and violent grievance connected to the building's history is killing them off one at a time. And Pete Walker shot the production almost entirely on location in an actual decommissioned English seaside theater, whose physical decay needed no production design enhancement. Walker made the flesh and blood show for Tygon British Film Productions, with a cast of theatre performers whose collective unfamiliarity with film acting Walker used deliberately, instructing them to play their characters' theatrical rehearsal scenes with genuine amateur theatrical energy, so that the violence, when it arrived, would feel like an intrusion from outside the performance, rather than an escalation within it. The Seaside Pavilion location, an actual abandoned structure on the English coast that the production secured for a shooting schedule extending across an off-season period when the building's owners had no other use for it, gave Walker's camera a genuine architectural decay that no studio construction could replicate, the salt-damaged walls and collapsed stage machinery becoming active participants in the violence rather than backdrop. The British Censorship Board required cuts to several sequences before certification, citing specifically the killer's methodology rather than any single image, a determination that reflected the board's developing unease with Walker's particular formal approach across his filmography. A director who consistently embedded extreme violence inside mundane British institutional settings rather than Gothic or exotic ones. The 3D sequence in the film's final act, shot using an actual stereoscopic 3D process that British cinemas of the period had limited capacity to project, requiring most audiences to watch the climax in conventional 2D regardless of the format Walker had intended, remains one of the strangest production decisions in 1970s British horror, a formally ambitious choice that the exhibition infrastructure of the time could not fully support. The Flesh and Blood show has been released through Kino Lorber in a restoration. Pete Walker made House of Whipcord 2 years later. The Seaside Pavilion location has since been demolished. The specific stereoscopic 3D footage from the climax exists in collector prints that vary significantly in quality depending on the projection equipment used to transfer them. The Flesh and Blood show used theatrical decay as its setting. Tower of Evil used something considerably more remote, an isolated lighthouse island off the English coast, a centuries-old curse connected to Phoenician artifacts, and a production crew that had to be transported to the actual filming location by boat for every single shooting day. Tower of Evil, 1972. Directed by Jim O'Connolly, a group of teenagers are murdered on a remote lighthouse island off the English coast, and the sole survivor, found catatonic and unable to explain what happened, draws a team of archaeologists and investigators back to the same island, where ancient Phoenician artifacts buried beneath the lighthouse appear connected to a violence that has nothing to do with the contemporary killer the investigators initially suspect. Jim O'Connolly made Tower of Evil, released in the United States under the alternate title Horror on Snape Island, for a production that required the entire cast and crew to be ferried to an actual remote British coastal location for every shooting day, a logistical commitment that gave the film's isolation a documentary authenticity rare in British horror of the period, where studio constructions more typically substituted for genuine remoteness. The dual narrative structure, alternating between the contemporary investigation and flashback sequences depicting what actually happened to the murdered teenagers, allowed O'Connolly to control the audience's information asymmetrically, withholding the killer's identity and methodology until the structure itself became the source of dread rather than any single reveal. Bryant Halliday plays the lead investigator with a procedural seriousness that the film's pulpier elements consistently undercut, a tonal tension that the British Censorship Board's review process specifically flagged when assessing the cumulative effect of the violence against the film's otherwise straightforward procedural framing. The lighthouse interior sequence, in which the investigation team becomes trapped inside the structure, with whatever is still picking off survivors, staged using the lighthouse's actual claustrophobic stairwells and narrow internal architecture that no set construction had built, was the content most discussed by British audiences who encountered the film through its limited theatrical run and subsequent television broadcasts. Tower of Evil has been released through Kino Lorber and Code Red in various home video editions. Jim O'Connolly worked primarily in British television following this production. The lighthouse location has been identified by location historians as a structure off the Cornish coast. The Phoenician artifact subplot has never been connected to any documented archaeological find. Crucible of Terror, 1971. Directed by Ted Hooker. A reclusive sculptor named Victor Clare has developed a bronze casting technique that produces statues of haunting, lifelike precision. And the gallery owner who travels with a group of investors to Clare's remote Cornish home to secure new pieces for an exhibition discovers, gradually and then all at once, exactly what Clare's casting process actually requires. Ted Hooker made Crucible of Terror for Glendale International Pictures with Mike Raven in the lead role as Victor Clare, Raven having built a brief but specific niche playing tormented, aristocratic horror antagonists in early 1970s British exploitation cinema, before retiring from acting entirely to become a farmer, a career transition that the genre's specific demands apparently could not retain him against. The Cornish coastal locations gave the film a genuine isolation that matched its premise, an actual remote artist's studio environment that the production secured rather than constructed, allowing the bronze casting sequences to be filmed with the specific procedural texture of an actual working studio rather than a set dressed to approximate one. The British Censorship Board's review focused specifically on the casting process sequences themselves, where Hooker's camera lingered on the mechanical details of Clare's technique with a clinical patience that the board found more unsettling than the film's more conventional, violent content, ultimately requiring trims to several sequences, depicting the preparation process in detail before certification. The final gallery exhibition sequence, in which the investors and gallery owner discover the true nature of Clare's most recent works displayed for sale, staged with a slow procedural reveal that withheld confirmation until the camera had no further angle left to avoid it, was the content most cited by audiences who encountered the film through British regional theatrical distribution and subsequent television screenings, as the moment the film's central horror became impossible to misread as metaphor. Crucible of Terror has been released through various home video labels, including Network Distributing in the UK. Ted Hooker made no further theatrical horror features. Mike Raven's specific transition from horror villain to farmer remains one of the more genuinely unusual career trajectories in British exploitation cinema history. The Cornish studio location has not been definitively identified by location historians. Crucible of Terror used an artist's process to disguise its horror. Slaughter Hotel used the opposite approach entirely, an upscale psychiatric clinic for wealthy patients, a killer moving freely among the staff, and Fernando Di Leo, applying the same formal precision he brought to Italian crime cinema to a slasher premise that arrived in American grindhouse theaters years before the American slasher cycle had fully formed its own rules. Slaughter Hotel 1971, directed by Fernando Di Leo. a private psychiatric clinic housing wealthy female patients with various sexual and psychological disorders, becomes the hunting ground for a killer moving among the staff and residents with complete freedom. And Fernando Di Leo, who would go on to define the Italian crime thriller through films like Milano Calibro 9, brought the same formal control over violence and institutional menace to this earlier production that the giallo format had only begun to systematize. Di Leo made Slaughter Hotel, released internationally under multiple alternate titles, including Cold-Blooded Beast and Asylum Erotica, reflecting the distribution confusion that surrounded much early 1970s Italian genre product entering foreign markets. For a production that used an actual converted villa as the clinic's primary location, giving the film's institutional setting a genuine architectural grandeur and isolation that a constructed set could not have matched on the same budget. Klaus Kinski plays the clinic's resident psychiatrist with the specific unsettling authority that Kinski brought to virtually every role he accepted during this period of his career, a performance whose ambiguous moral position within the institution Di Leo used to maintain suspicion across the entire staff, rather than allowing the killer's identity to feel predetermined by casting alone. The film entered the American grindhouse circuit through regional distribution deals, years before Halloween established the American slasher template, which means Slaughter Hotel's specific combination of institutional setting and methodical violence predates the genre conventions it superficially resembles, an accident of timing that the film's subsequent critical reassessment has only recently begun to properly credit. The greenhouse sequence, in which one of the clinic's patients is killed among the institution's decorative plant displays, using a weapon whose specific cruelty the practical effects team rendered with more explicit detail than the giallo format typically permitted at this point in the cycle's development, was the content that generated the most consistent regional censorship friction across the territories where the film received distribution. Slaughter Hotel has been released through Raro Video and subsequently Severin Films in restored editions. Fernando Di Leo moved into crime cinema almost immediately after this production, and rarely discussed it in subsequent interviews. Klaus Kinski's involvement remains the film's most consistently cited element among collectors. The Italian villa location has been identified by Italian film historians as a property outside Rome. Slaughter Hotel used a psychiatric clinic and Klaus Kinski's unsettling presence. House of Whipcord used something the British system found considerably harder to dismiss as foreign exploitation, an English women's prison run entirely outside any legal authority, operated by a retired judge who believed the country's actual courts had grown too lenient, and Pete Walker built an entire film around the specific horror of institutional cruelty operating with complete impunity.
She's a dangerous psychopath and must be hanged immediately.
Maya, what is Ma?
Eyes of Fendi, pluck them out, Desmond. Albert, pluck them out, I say.
It's no good fake thinking.
House of Whipcord, 1974, directed by Pete Walker. A young French model is lured to a remote English country house that turns out to be an illegal private prison operated by a retired judge and his wife who believe the formal British justice system has become too permissive toward what they consider moral degeneracy, and the women held there are subjected to the judge's own invented system of punishment entirely outside any actual legal framework, with no possibility of appeal or rescue. Pete Walker made House of Whipcord for his own production company with a script by David McGillivray that Walker has described in interviews as a direct response to the conservative moral panic literature circulating in early 1970s Britain, material that argued explicitly for harsher punishment of young women perceived as sexually permissive which Walker and McGillivray took at face value and extended to its logical, horrifying conclusion. Barbara Markham plays Mrs. Wakehurst, the judge's wife and the institution's actual operational authority, with a chilling, matter-of-fact conviction that her actions constitute genuine moral correction rather than cruelty. A performance the British Censorship Board found more disturbing in its sincerity than any more theatrically villainous approach would have produced. Walker shot the prison interiors in an actual large English country house, whose genuine period architecture gave the institutional cruelty a believable historical weight. The Georgian grandeur of the building, working in direct tension against the medieval punishment systems operating inside it. The hanging sequence in the film's final act, in which the institution's logic reaches its absolute and irreversible conclusion, staged by Walker with a procedural coldness that refused any of the cathartic violence the genre typically offered as compensation, was the content the British Board of Film Censors required the most extensive cuts to address before certification, and remains the sequence most frequently discussed by critics examining Walker's broader filmography as the moment his specific brand of institutional horror reached its most fully realized expression. House of Whipcord has been released through Kino Lorber in a restoration. Pete Walker made Frightmare the same year, and House of Mortal Sin 2 years later, completing what critics have retrospectively termed his institutional horror trilogy. David McGillivray continued writing for Walker across multiple subsequent productions. The English country house location has been identified, but is now a private residence, whose current owners have no public connection to the production. Schizo 1976, directed by Pete Walker. A successful ice skater named Samantha marries and begins receiving threatening attention from a stranger who appears to know intimate details about a childhood trauma she has never publicly discussed. And as the stalking escalates toward violence, the film withholds whether the threat is connected to actual supernatural retribution, genuine psychiatric breakdown, or a far more mundane and procedurally explicable cause that Walker delays revealing until the narrative has exhausted every more sensational possibility first. Pete Walker made Schizo for his own production company, working again with screenwriter David McGillivray, in a deliberate departure from the institutional settings of House of Whipcord and House of Mortal Sin toward a more conventional thriller structure that Walker used to examine how British media and psychiatric institutions process and ultimately fail women reporting genuine threats against them. Lynn Frederick plays Samantha with a controlled vulnerability that the film consistently tests against an unsympathetic procedural environment. Her character's credibility undermined repeatedly by police and medical professionals who treat her fear as symptomatic rather than evidentiary. A narrative choice that gives the film's eventual violence a specific institutional culpability beyond whatever the actual killer is doing. The British Censorship Board's review focused on several explicit kill sequences involving household implements deployed with a domestic, almost mundane brutality that Walker staged specifically to avoid any of the gothic theatricality that might have made the violence feel more comfortably fictional. The knitting needle sequence, in which a kill is executed using an ordinary domestic object in a manner so procedurally specific that the British Board of Film Censors required modifications before certification, remains the content most frequently cited by audiences who encountered the film through its British theatrical run and subsequent video distribution, as the moment Walker's commitment to grounding extreme violence in mundane domestic objects reached its most uncomfortable expression. Schizo has been released through Network Distributing and Vinegar Syndrome in restored editions. Pete Walker continued directing through the remainder of the decade before retiring from filmmaking entirely in the early 1980s. Lynn Frederick married Peter Sellers the same year the film was released and died in 1994. The specific psychiatric institution depicted in the film's flashback sequences does not correspond to any documented British facility. Schizo grounded its horror in domestic objects and institutional disbelief. House of Mortal Sin grounded its horror somewhere the British censorship system had almost no precedent for addressing. Inside the Catholic confessional itself, where a priest's psychological collapse produces a killer whose access to his victim's deepest secrets comes directly from the one institution built specifically to keep those secrets safe. House of Mortal Sin, 1976, directed by Pete Walker. A young woman seeking guidance begins confessing to a Catholic priest whose own psychological deterioration the Church has either failed to notice or deliberately ignored. And as she becomes entangled in his escalating obsession, the information she has confessed under the seal of absolute religious confidentiality becomes the exact information he uses to control, threaten, and ultimately kill the people around her. Pete Walker made House of Mortal Sin, released in the United States under the alternate title The Confessional, as the concluding entry in what critics later termed his institutional horror trilogy, working once more with David McGillivray on a script that several British distributors initially declined to handle, given the specific provocation of depicting a serial killer using the Catholic confessional as his operational information network. Anthony Sharp plays Father Xavier Meldrum with a performance built entirely around controlled, soft-spoken menace. A man whose religious authority the film never allows to be mistaken for genuine faith, presenting his psychological collapse as something the Church's own institutional structure, enabled through its absolute commitment to confessional secrecy, regardless of what that secrecy was being used to conceal. The Catholic Church in Britain reportedly raised formal objections to the production before release, objections that Walker addressed by ensuring the film's credits explicitly stated the events depicted were not representative of the actual Catholic clergy, a disclaimer that did little to reduce the controversy once the film reached British cinemas. The confessional booth sequence in the film's climax, in which the specific mechanics of how Father Meldrum has been using confessional information against his victims, becomes explicit, staged by Walker with the same procedural coldness that had defined House of Whipcord 2 years earlier, generated the most sustained censorship friction of any film in Walker's filmography, with several territories requiring additional cuts beyond what the British board itself had demanded. House of Mortal Sin has been released through Network Distributing and Kino Lorber in restored editions. Pete Walker has discussed the production in retrospective interviews as the film he is most frequently asked to defend, given its specific provocation toward Catholic institutional authority. Anthony Sharp continued working in British television and film until his death in 1989. The specific church location used for the confessional sequences has never been publicly identified by the production. 8 films, one country's specific genius for turning institutions you were supposed to trust into the source of the horror itself. Courts, churches, art galleries, psychiatric clinics, all of them failing the people inside them long before any killer arrived to finish the job. Which institution on tonight's list frightened you more than the actual killer did? Leave it in the comments, like if Pete Walker's name was new to you tonight. Subscribe. We go further into his filmography next time, and what the British press actually said about him while he was making it.